You're listening to Three Kitchens Podcast, hosted by home cooks Erin Walker and Heather Dyer.
Are you tired of cooking the same old things? So are we. Let's all get inspired, cook better, and eat great food.
Welcome to Three Kitchens Podcast. I'm your host, Heather Dyer, here with my co-host, Erin Walker.
Good morning, Heather.
Good morning, Erin. And today we are very excited because we have a special guest that we've really been looking forward to meeting and chatting with. Her name is Amy Clark, and she is the host of the Talking Appalachian Podcast and is the founding director of the Center for Appalachian Studies at the University of Virginia's College at Wise. Is that correct, Amy?
That's correct, yes.
Welcome. We're so happy we're so happy you're here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I came across your podcast through on a podcast Facebook group where people meet and suggest guests and say, hey, I'd like to be a guest or whatever. And I thought, this looks interesting. So I went and checked you out. And then I said, hey, you really should come on our show and talk about Appalachian culture and traditions through the lens of food. Because that's kind of where our worlds can meet. And our interests. I mean, Erin and I like history and culture of all kinds from all perspectives, but if we can bring it through food, then we're like extra happy.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Food is such a big part of our culture in Appalachia, as it is in lots of places, but a lot of things center around food. You find food at the center of a lot of traditional things and ritualistic things that people do in their communities.
Mm-hmm.
Right. This region is a region that I don't know a lot about. It's really large, and I didn't realize how far it spreads. Can you give us a brief rundown on sort of like what is Appalachia, or where is Appalachia?
I'd love to. Appalachia is a really misunderstood place. And a lot of that has to do with the way that it's been portrayed in popular culture, unfortunately. But it's a 900-mile, if you go by the topography of the Appalachian Mountain Range, it's 900 miles long. There are two maps that we talk about in Appalachia. There's the Appalachian Regional Commission map, which is the federal map, and that extends from way down in Mississippi all the way up to New York, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And that's the map that defines boundaries and that our legislators use to get funding. So they're going to pull that map into their territories as much as possible. If they've got a little bit of the Appalachian Mountains, they're going to pull it in there, right? But then there's the cultural map, and that's the map where, and I have that defined in my book, Talking Appalachian, because our linguistic heritage, our linguistic similarities don't extend that far north and that far south. Plus, if you start looking at communities, if you start talking to people in communities that far north and that far south, they do not identify with Appalachia. So it's sort of where you see the cultural similarities and where you see people identifying with an Appalachian heritage and an Appalachian identity. The map is a little bit smaller. It goes from like northern Alabama up to about western Pennsylvania, over, into Ohio, all of West Virginia. But it's just a little bit more narrow, a little bit more defined. Our culture was primarily established by the early Scots-Irish settlers, English settlers, German settlers, Indigenous Americans. And then later, when industrialization occurred, Appalachia's, primary industries were extraction industries, so coal and timber, and that brought a lot of immigrants. Mm-hmm. And so we had a lot of coal camps in all the way up and down Appalachia, from Pennsylvania all the way down. I live in central Appalachia, so I live at the confluence of Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and western North Carolina. So about where all of those states come together, that's sort of where I'm located, kind of in the heart of Appalachia, in the heart of the coal fields. But those drew in a lot of immigrants, and they brought their foods and they brought their cultural, their religions and things like that. So we're more diverse than people think we are, Hillbilly is a word that's often associated with Appalachia. And if you look up the definition of hillbilly, it's a white mountaineer, it's a white Southerner, it's very it's a very narrow definition, and we have become more diverse, but certainly industrialization brought so many people in. And so that's where things like our dialect were established and formed, and our traditions and foods and things like that came from those early settlers.
That's a very big melting pot.
That's a big part of our culture. I went to Ireland last year, and so much of the Irish music is so similar to what we have here. Our roots are in Ireland and Scotland, of course. The banjo is African. So we have so much influence from so many different places, but especially this time of year, from summer well into fall, Appalachia is just full of music and food festivals. They're just celebrating the harvest, celebrating music and food. That's what we do. And you have a festival every weekend until the weather turns cold. We have a canon of literature. We have Appalachian literature and some wonderful Appalachian authors. And I like to have those on my podcast as much as I possibly can, that write in the dialect or write stories around our history and our timeline. So there's a lot about our mountains that I'm proud of. They're old, they're very old, they're ancient, they're beautiful. This is probably one of the most beautiful times of year right now here, with the leaves turning and everything.
Right.
In a nutshell, that's Appalachia. And when we call it Appalachia. Now there's a controversy. There's an Appalachia controversy, and it starts to fight.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. So on the outer fringes mostly, and in the north mostly, people will say Appalachia. But the majority of the region, especially in the central and southern parts, will say Appalachia, and they will die on that mountain. You don't say it any other way.
Okay.
There's a saying, if you say it wrong, I'll throw an Appalachia. And that's how they get people to remember.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And I did a podcast on that vowel, and it is a contentious vowel. People will fight you over the long A versus the short A. Yeah.
I had listened to that episode beforehand, and before I had listened to it, one of my questions for you was, from somebody coming from the outside, to make sure that we're pronouncing it right, because you do hear all these different pronunciations. And I was like, so how do we go about best with this? Like,
you're safest with Latch. You're safest with Appalachia. Yeah, you're safest.
That's where you please most people.
And I feel like Amy's right in the middle of it. So however she says it, I think is going to be the way we should all say it, because she's in the heart.
I'm not as uptight about it as a lot of people are, but I think, and I talked about this in that episode, I think people equate that with people trying to impose something on to our region that they think should be there. I think that's how they perceive it in their minds. If you change the pronunciation, you're trying to bring something in that we don't own. But there are people I have found people who were raised here, who were raised to say it with the long A, and they still identify as Appalachian. And so I stopped saying there's a right or wrong. I stopped saying that, and I don't get so caught up in it anymore. But it's really interesting, I think, to study how people react to that and the psychology behind that. Appalachian's not unique to that. I mean, I've been corrected for saying things.
Oh,
Sharon McCrum, she's an Appalachian author, and she has a video on YouTube where she talks about the difference between Derry and Londonderry in Ireland, and what you say determines your politics. I mean, people will make a judgment about your politics, about your people, about your background if you say Derry or if you say Londonderry, because it was a political shift. Yeah. So she explains Appalachia that way by comparing it to that town.
Right.
I think the linguistics are just so fascinating.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed through your podcast learning about all kinds of things like the intrusive T and stuff that I'd never heard of before. And I'm like, I missed a calling. I should have been a linguist or something, because I find it just like so fascinating. I love it.
Yeah, the language study, and then just sort of the discussion around how people perceive and make assumptions about the way someone speaks a language.
Yeah, there are a lot of associations, and Appalachian dialects, and I say that in the plural because there are so many different ones depending on where you are. They're working class dialects. And when certain dialects of a language are associated with race or with class, then when people make judgments about them, it's sort of a way of judging the person without openly judging the person. You judge the dialect instead, right? It's a way of getting your prejudice out there without being open about it, because that's taboo. It's still not really taboo to make fun of Appalachian people. I think, it's been said by a lot of writers and scholars that we're the last group of people you can openly ridicule and not get any repercussions for that. But it's really more of a class issue with Appalachia than anything else, the way that people respond to the dialects. And I grew up being a little self-conscious, and so many of us have this story in Appalachia. You grow up being and Jack talked about this in Scotland. I mean, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. There's a vernacular dialect everywhere, but you grow up self-conscious about it because you know how different it is from what you see on television, what we think of as standard English, right? Or what people call proper English or correct English. It's just standard English, and that's another dialect of English. It's the power dialect. It's the one that we've chosen as the most clear, one that will travel the best, right? So that's the one we teach in our schools. And so anything outside of that is othered. And I grew up very self-conscious of that. And it wasn't until I started to understand why I sounded the way that I did. And my dialect's changed. My dialect has standardized a lot since I was, I don't sound at all like I did when I was a kid. You still hear my accent, but everything else has changed because I'm in academia. But listening to my family, my great-grandparents and grandparents and my parents, I started to get really fascinated with why they sounded the way they did, and why we said the things we did, and why we said soup beans instead of pinto beans, and why we used certain phrases. And I think my great grandmother was the one that got me interested in linguistics, because I would sit on the porch with her. I was born to very young parents, so I had my great grandmother in my life until I was 30, and I met my great great grandfather. So we would sit, and a lot of this happened around food, the storytelling. We would sit on the porch and snap beans. I would help her snap beans, and she would just tell story after story after story in that rich, poetic Appalachian dialect. And she would just say she just talk country. That's what she would describe. That's how she would describe it. We would make molasses in the fall. We would harvest sugar cane and make molasses. And I would listen to stories. We would harvest tobacco. And as they graded the leaves, I would listen to stories. And, every family Sunday dinner or holiday dinner, it all just sort of revolved around food. But when I recorded her for a college class, and then I transcribed what she said in her stories, that really was when it hit me, when I was typing and her voice came into my ears and through my fingers, and I was really actively listening to her for the first time, not just sitting on the porch and passively listening, but actively hearing the way she was saying things. And it was such a pure form of the dialect. And I thought, I just have to know how this came down generation after generation after generation,
Despite like external influence, and like, how did they keep it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of that, and you're right. I mean, we had the invention of the radio that didn't change it. TV didn't change it. The internet and Zoom. I mean, you still hear so much of it. And I think it's because people, first of all, they grow up speaking the way their family speaks and their community speaks. And then after a while, they make a decision about whether they're going to keep that or whether they're going to code switch, which is being able to switch back and forth from standard to your home voice, or whether they're going to get rid of it altogether, which a lot of people do because they just don't want to deal with the judgment. A lot of people who go into the military tell me that they erase their dialect because they get so much heckling.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but I think the people who do choose are choosing because they want to stay rooted to place and home and that identity that they've decided to embrace. And that's a very powerful thing, and it's a very powerful reason to do that.
Yeah, I love those stories of hearing the stories from your elder family members. I love that. That's sweet.
I'm really grateful for, it was hard on my parents to be teenagers and have me, but I'm really grateful for that now that I look back and see the history that I learned. And I called my great grandmother Mamaw. That's what a lot of us in Appalachia call our grandmas, Mamaw and Granny.
Mm-hmm.
She never understood the fascination with anything that she had to say. She herself. She had sort of started to decline in her memory by the time I really started to get invested in linguistic studies. So I didn't really get to talk to her about that. But I know when I recorded her and recorded her stories, and I said, my professor wants me to write them exactly the way you're saying them, that just baffled her. She couldn't understand why she was worthy of being recorded or studied or anything like that.
Right.
But I see that now, and I'm glad I have those now for my kids to hear.
Yeah, that's not just grandma speak. That's
Yeah.
that's an accent, right? Sometimes you don't realize that when you grow up with it, and it's just part of your life.
Yeah, exactly. You have a moment of awareness because what you hear from people, even people who speak with the dialect, what you'll hear them say is, my English is terrible. I speak bad English. And so you grow up hearing that it's just bad English. You don't grow up hearing that it's a dialect or what that means. A dialect is accent and vocabulary and grammar patterns all put together. It's the recipe for a dialect: accent, grammar patterns, and vocabulary. Nobody teaches you that.
No.
People don't know that. Even
No.
we started in our teacher training program at UVA Wise, we started a class where we teach this because teachers don't get classes in sociolinguistics. When their students are bringing these dialects to their classroom, it becomes the bad English, good English binary. And that's not good because you don't want to think that your home voice is bad English. It's not. It's just different. It's a different dialect. And I work really hard with teachers to try to change that perception with education. If everybody thought that and they were ashamed of it and they erased it for that reason, then we wouldn't have this rich body of artistic work that includes the dialects, like the literature and movies, the wonderful body of work that's come out of Appalachia, particularly since starting around the 1940s. We had sort of an Appalachian Renaissance with a lot of wonderful work where the Appalachian identity started to form. A lot of novels and a lot of poetry and things like that. And then as movies and, podcasts. And now we just have such a rich body of work that wouldn't be there, I think, if everybody had embraced this idea that it was bad and that it shouldn't be tolerated.
Well, you mentioned hillbilly earlier. Another one that kind of stuck out when I was listening to your podcast was redneck, which I found the history of that word really interesting because Erin and I live in Alberta, Canada, and redneck is something that particularly the rest of the country refers to Albertans as rednecks. It's something that we have always been.
Yeah.
Really?
It's like an insult from other people. I think those of us here are like, meh, whatever. But
it's like that prairie, like hick kind of thing
is
too.
Word.
Is another word that kind of follows Albertan around.
So I thought it was interesting that it's also part of your cultural fabric a little bit too, that word that. And can you tell us what is the history of that word?
That is fascinating that you all have that. Yeah, I think it's associated. Yeah, I think it's associated with rural. It's again working class, but and this is my take on it. Someone else might have a different take on it, but I think the difference in redneck and hillbilly is that a redneck is more of a troublemaker than a hillbilly is.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Here, when you talk about redneck, that's more of you have to be more careful about how you use that. But redneck has its history. One of the theories is that redneck's history, it's not a theory, it definitely did happen. During the coal mining wars, when coal miners started to organize into labor unions in the early 20th century, it was a really dangerous thing to do because coal companies would bring in detectives and police guards to root out these coal miners, and sometimes they were murdered. Sometimes they would pick one and make an example of him and murder him in front of the others, or they would run their entire family out of town and threaten to kill them if they didn't leave. So they wanted to organize into labor unions because they weren't being paid fairly. They didn't have safety measures in place. They weren't compensated fairly. Whatever they were paid in scrip, which was like monopoly money. at the company store. And so they were
Oh, yeah.
always in debt to the company. And so they wanted more agency over their lives. And that's how these labor unions started, but they were seen as troublemakers. And they had to be very secretive about that until the day when they called everybody out on strike. And so one of the ways that you called everybody out on strike was you pulled a red bandana out of your pocket and you tied it around your neck. And
Very
so
cool.
that was solidarity that marked you as a union miner. And if everybody did it at once, there's safety in numbers, right? And so they couldn't isolate you. And so they got the name rednecks and they embraced that name and they called themselves rednecks. And so eventually this culminated into kind of a war between the coal companies and 10,000 miners that marched on Blair Mountain in West Virginia. And the government even, I think, sent the National Guard. It was a terrible, and they lost, but eventually they got the right to organize into labor unions, and eventually they got what they were fighting for. But that's the origin of redneck, and unfortunately, that's not something a lot of the younger generations know now.
Yeah, that it wasn't rooted as an insult. Although the troublemaker thing is kind of interesting.
The troublemaker makes me, yeah.
I actually kind of like that. I don't mind that.
I kind of like it, yeah.
That's okay.
A redneck, I think redneck has just a little bit more of they're edgier. The redneck would be edgier than the hillbilly. The hillbilly just, they're here and they live and they do their thing.
Right.
Redneck is a little bit of an edgier term.
Okay. So many cool things to talk about.
Welcome to Talking Appalachian, a podcast about voice, identity, and community. Based on the book Talking Appalachian, co-edited by Amy Clark and Nancy Hayward, this podcast explores the heritage of Appalachian words, grammar, and accents throughout the region. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow us on Facebook so you never miss an episode.
I'm Amy, born and raised in Lee County, Virginia. On the podcast, I'll cover a wide range of topics, from our ways of speaking to our literature, folklore, superstitions, and traditions. So pull up a chair or sit down in the porch swing and let's talk Appalachian.
Maybe we should talk about some food.
Okay.
We asked you, Amy, to send us some suggested recipes that we could try, things that are traditional to you and your family and where you come from. So can you tell us what those dishes were that you chose and why you chose them?
So I think I chose soup beans and cornbread. And did I send killed lettuce?
Yes.
Killed lettuce? Okay.
Yes.
I chose those, and I actually talked to people about this after I sent you those recipes, and they said, "Did you send soup beans and cornbread? Did you send soup beans and cornbread?" And I said, "Yes, that's what I sent. That's what everybody." It was like overwhelmingly, that was the vote. So I sent soup beans and cornbread, and I think I sent you two different kinds of cornbread. There's sweet cornbread, and there's cornbread that isn't sweet. Soup beans and cornbread is a staple of the Appalachian region, and the non-vernacular term is pinto beans, right? But rarely anyone calls it pinto beans here. It's just known as soup beans. I thought of soup beans for a personal reason because my great-grandmother always had a pot of soup beans on the stove and always had a pound of cornbread nearby. Every day. You could walk in her house at any day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and you would find soup beans and cornbread. She came up in the Depression era, and she lived on a farm, and she cooked. She cooked for farm hands. She never had a paying job outside her home. She was a homemaker, and so she cooked for the farm hands. And, especially during the Depression, that was a cheap meal. It was a high protein meal. It was nutritious. It was really easy to make, and you could make large quantities of it and feed men. And then the cornbread, same thing, very easy to make. And what people like to do is crumble their cornbread into their soup beans, and sometimes they'll add onion. Sometimes they'll add a relish. Here, chow chow is very popular here. It's a type of relish, peppers and onions and things like that in it. And I've heard of people putting Tabasco sauce on it, although I would never do that. But I know some people like to put Tabasco sauce on everything. But you could crumble, you could just have this big bowl full of a hearty meal, and they would drink that they would eat that with buttermilk and then get right back out to work. And then I was talking with my cousin this morning who grew up with me, and we shared the same memo, and she said, you remember after 2 or 3 days, she would turn the beans into goulash. And goulash was like this, she would add macaroni and tomatoes to the beans. Whatever she had, I guess, left over from other meals, she would create this sort of stew with the beans. And that would be a way of using what was left over. I didn't remember her making goulash, but my cousin remembered it, and she said that she would do that. Then it just sort of became, I think of her when I make soup, beans, and cornbread. I just think of her, and I just think of how I looked forward to that. Every time I went to her house, I knew that there was a meal on the stove, and sometimes they would add fried potatoes to it. But that was a really good, everybody loves, almost everybody loves it. It's just a good meal. You find it at Cracker Barrel. Cracker Barrel has soup, beans, and cornbread down here.
Oh,
If
wow.
you go to a Cracker Barrel. So that was soup, beans, and cornbread. And then, there's a cake type of cornbread, and there's a type of cornbread that's just doesn't have sugar. It's and cornbread is a quick bread. It's flour and cornmeal and butter. And then if you do the cake type, you can add sour cream, you can add eggs, you can add sugar, and that makes it fluffier and more cake tasting. And this is where people divide. There are people that like the cake, and there are people that do not. My dad is a non-cake cornbread eater. So if I make a meal for my family, I've got to have both. So that's soup, beans, and cornbread.
So we made, Erin made the beans and I made the cornbread, and it was fantastic. And I remember when we were emailing at first, because you sort of just said, you put this with that. And, it wasn't like what we would expect a traditional recipe to look like. And we were like, oh no, like, we were like, Amy, are you sure this is the recipe? Like, what are we supposed to do? How do we make it? Like, and then we realized as we, sat with it a little bit and talked about it, and we're like, okay, this is how these things are handed down.
Yes.
Often it's an oral tradition of handing a recipe down, and it's not written anywhere. Erin came upon this with her Oma and a strudel that she made, and she had to watch her and write it as she watched. That's a bit more involved recipe, but it's a similar thing. It was all in her grandma's head, right? And clearly you've learned to make these recipes without them written down. And then I think we learned you don't need, like, these are so simple to make, both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I forgot to add that you flavor, I hope I told you this, and I don't remember if I did, but you flavor your soup beans with meat, maybe ham, salt and pepper. You have to flavor them because they don't have flavor until you add the flavor. Did I tell you to do that, or did you figure that out?
We did figure it out. We did, because we're a little more structure needed.
Yeah. You looked it up.
I did some Googling and went through some recipes to kind of get an idea of what are we aiming for? What are sort of some of the measurements? What are some common ingredients? What's kind of between all of them? And so I did come across a recipe that was called Appalachian soup beans, and then in brackets, pinto bean soup. So I was like, oh, I have to be on the right track. This sounds like where I'm going. For the recipe, they recommended a smoked ham hock.
Yeah.
But I only had fresh ham hocks available at our grocery store. So I roasted my ham hocks before adding them into the soup beans, just to add some more flavor to it and to cook a new cut of meat that I had never touched before. Because it's like, when have I ever been told to buy ham hocks? Like, that's not something, but delicious meat, super tasty, pretty inexpensive, easy to cook. Like, I could have just roasted them and shredded it up and had that with anything. I really enjoyed the opportunity to discover like something new to cook, and I will buy that now and I will use that ingredient for sure.
And imagine if it had been smoked. That would have just like taken it up.
I did see some smoked ones at the farmer's market when I was there last week, and I was like, ooh, I know where I need to come back to next time.
Nice.
These were really easy to make. They were really, really delicious. And I had some left over that I kept, and I put them in the freezer. And then when we made just like a basic soup last night for dinner, I added that in there and it just made everything, they broke down so nice. They were really creamy. I can see the goulash thing wanting to add that like,
Yeah, they get creamier.
yeah, they get
They
so
get
good.
creamier over time, 2 or 3 days. They get creamier and creamier, the broth. I like to use country ham slices. Country ham is just salted, cured ham. And then you
Okay.
can get these slice packs at the store that I find that that's really easy, just to get these thin packs of country ham and just put it in the beans and
Mm,
I think where it's so salty, it adds so much flavor to them. Yeah.
mhm, mhm.
Did you make both kinds of cornbread or just the regular cornbread?
I actually just made the cake style cornbread because we've made cornbread before, the kind of not sweet version, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if Jiffy cornbread mix is a thing here or if I just couldn't find it. Is it, Erin?
I don't think we get it here.
We can't get it here. Okay. But I did find a former guest of the podcast who has a website called Savory Experiments. She actually developed a recipe that is the exact same thing as Jiffy cornbread. So she makes that when she doesn't have Jiffy on hand. And so I mixed that up, and I think it was cornmeal and flour, kind of a basic mix. I can't remember exactly, but I will, when I write the recipe, I will include that if anyone would like to have it. And so this version of cornbread has creamed corn in it, which I think made all the difference here because it was extra moist. And Erin and I have had conversations before about our mutual love for creamed corn. Some people really don't like creamed corn.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned before, it has eggs and sugar and sour cream. So it is very moist. It's fluffy and I just thought it was really delicious. And with the beans, it all, because you got the little bit of sweetness with the cornbread. And then depending on how you, like if you salt your beans or kind of salty beans and sweet cornbread, I just thought it was delicious.
Yeah.
It is. And a variation on cornbread, not the cake kind, but the regular kind. One of the variations, especially in the summer, that we do is you can spoon it into a skillet and fry it into these little cakes, and we call those hoe cake.
Okay.
Oh, that's what a hoe cake is. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
when you fry cornbread. Yeah.
Oh, I've heard that and didn't know what it was. Oh, that's cool.
Well, that's what we call it. It could a hoe cake could be something else to somebody else, but that's what I've always heard it called.
That sounds yummy.
Oh, that sounds really
are.
good.
Yeah. Just a different way of incorporating cornbread into the meal.
Yum.
Did you do the killed lettuce?
Oh, yeah.
You did?
We
Oh,
did.
okay.
We each did this
Okay.
separately. So I made cornbread, she did beans, and we swapped. We shared with each other, and then we each separately made killed lettuce, which was totally new to us. That was kind of fun to make because it was something so different.
It was definitely, as we looked at it and talked about it before we went into it, we were like,
How's this going to be?
I had some expectations of like, well, I don't know what that's really going to turn out like. When we were reading about it and doing a little bit of background info on it, I came across that you can also just put the bacon that you fry up right into the lettuce. And so I did that. So I had bacon that I sliced up into little bits. I fried it up. I had some red leaf lettuce, looked really good at the store. And so it was just that and some green onions. And then I was surprised at how ungreasy it was. I thought that bacon fat would like coat everything, that it would kind of wilt a lot more, that it might be kind of
Slimy lettuce?
less appetizing because I
Yeah.
wasn't sure what was going to happen, but it coated the lettuce nicely. The little bits of bacon in there were fantastic. My one kid was like, more, like had a lot of it. I mean, the bacon really helps because who doesn't love bacon? But I was quite surprised at how it turned out. When reading that, it would have been something that I would have been like, no, I don't think I'm going to try that. Like,
I can see that.
Yeah.
When you wilt it, that's why it's called killed lettuce. And I don't know who came up with that term, but killing it means putting maybe it's because it's so unhealthy to eat that all because it's bacon grease. But that's what you're doing. You're killing the lettuce when you add that final topping of bacon grease. And like I said, that's mostly something people make in the summer, in the summer months when they harvest their lettuce gardens. And they just take that lettuce out of their gardens and add it to a summer meal. But that's something you would serve with soup, beans, and cornbread. That would go right along with that meal. I was scrolling and I saw an article by Southern Living about killed lettuce, and that's what they called it. And they said an Appalachian dish, an Appalachian salad. They did a whole feature on killed lettuce. Yeah.
How cool is that?
What is the origin of it? Like, was it to not waste the fat, or like, I was trying to think about
I think so. I mean,
Yeah.
people tend to save their bacon grease. And my great grandmother did. My mom does. I mean, they tend to save it, just sort of set it aside and continue to use it. I don't know definitively what the origin is, but I would say, prior to having processed salad dressings and things like that in your grocery store, that's what you had to flavor your lettuce. That's what you had for flavor, and so that's what people use.
Yeah, we're also of the save your bacon grease camps. We do that too, and use it for all kinds of things because it adds great flavor to stuff. I actually used bacon grease that I had in a little jar in my freezer. I just let it thaw out and then warmed it up. I think honestly, fresh fried bacon, put that grease on the lettuce would have been tastier. I feel like it lost a little something by using the bacon fat that I had saved and in the freezer, but I can see how this is like a great way to use a bit of that, right? And if you don't have other oils, maybe handy.
It's just a very flavorful
And
salad.
with like fresh young lettuce.
Yes.
I know that's not what we had right now, but when we do have fresh lettuce in the spring and stuff, or if you're growing some, like, I'll be revisiting that again, hopefully with a garden this year.
So good. It's so good. It's making me hungry right now just thinking about it. But yeah.
This is one of the problems with this. All these discussions make us hungry.
And we always record right before lunch, and then we're like, oh, I'm starving for lunch.
Yeah.
Yeah. The soup beans were the most favorite. In my house, I had one of my kids had seconds, and then there was a little bit left over, and the next day he ate it as an after-school snack. He was really, he said, when are you making these beans? Because, he said, when is Erin making more beans? And I'm like, well, I think I need to make them now for you. Erin cannot cook for you every week.
They're so good. We're having an Appalachian Heritage Week next week at the college. And one of the things we're going to do is the cafeteria is going to serve soup, beans, and cornbread, and along with some other things. But that's going to be one of the primary dishes. And I'd say there's going to be a lot of students that are going to try it that have never had it before. So
that's fun.
And beans are such a good, like, to have something that is that hearty and filling and that can be the center of your meal and not be extremely expensive. I mean, between the ham hocks, which I think I had 2 for maybe like $5 or $6 for the package, and then the dried beans, you're talking about a lot of food for a very,
very little bit of money.
Very low budget, and it stretches far.
It does. And one of the things this time of year, especially, people are doing is, like I said, people make molasses and they make apple butter. And so, I saw a group of people making apple butter this past weekend, big copper pot out in the yard stirring the apple butter. And so people like to put that on their cornbread, sort of as a dessert, as a tasty treat after a meal. Put molasses or apple butter on your cornbread or your biscuit.
Is making molasses from scratch an involved process?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We would, they grow the sugar cane in the summer, and then they would harvest it. And this was all on my mama's property. And they had a shed, and they had a hole in the ground under the shed, and they would build a fire in the hole. And then they had a boiling pan hoisted with chains over that fire. And so the sugar cane would have to be crushed. They had a machine. They would run it through these two wheels with the cogs, and the juice would run out. You boil the juice, and that was a long process. And that was where the kids could get involved, because we would take pie pans, punch holes in the pie pans, nail them to broom handles, and because as it's boiling, this white stuff would form on the surface, and you would skim that off and put it in a bucket because you don't want that in your molasses.
Oh,
And
okay.
so it would boil and boil and boil for hours and hours and hours. And then when it's done, they would bring the pan up, let it cool, and then they would put it into mason jars. They would always sell out. I mean, every year people would pre-order the molasses and they would sell out. But they would do that over and over and over every day until the sugar cane was gone. And it was so much fun. It was so much fun. I couldn't wait to get off the bus after school and go to my mama's house and see what they were doing with the molasses. It was a really good time. And people in the community would come by. People like to stop by and sit and watch it boil and pick up a pie pan and help skim. They wanted to be involved in the process. And it was just, and you would listen to story after story after story.
I love these food preparations that take time and that really bring people together, and it not just family, like you say, like the whole community. And I feel like it really fits well with this resurgence that's coming around about slow food and the slow food movement that's happening, because I think these types of traditions where you do things like that are something that's really lost, and the sense that gives you if you've created your own, right? Like if you're then cooking with this molasses that you've prepared yourself, it's going to be a lot of a deeper connection to what you're doing than what's in my pantry in a box right now, right?
And so many hands helped prepare it, and so many stories were told over it. I mean, it's almost a spiritual thing. It's And my family doesn't do that anymore. All the older people are gone. And the younger people have careers, and they're not planting and harvesting sugarcane and doing those things anymore. So that's gone. There's some families left that are making it in the community, but they're fewer and fewer. But I'm glad that I put together, and I'm so grateful for the teacher in college that encouraged us to put these things together, because I have a little book with pictures and the story and the process and everything. I've captured that, and I can hand that down and say, this is what we did in our family at one time.
That's lovely. Well, this has just been so much fun, and we've learned so much, and we really encourage our listeners to go and listen to your podcast, Talking Appalachian, because it's so interesting, and it's not only about speech and linguistics, but all aspects of culture and the society and history, and it's just really, really interesting. So we encourage you all to go listen to that. We will include links in our show notes, so you can just scroll on down and click those and find Amy and all her guests and everything they're talking about. We'll link to your book, and anything else you got going on that you'd like to promote, please, why don't you tell people where they can find those things?
Well, I'm on social at Talking Appalachian on Facebook and on Instagram, and you can find the podcast on just about any podcasting platform. It's Talking Appalachian Podcast.
Wonderful.
And the book is called Talking Appalachian too, and that you can find that on Amazon or University Press of Kentucky.
Excellent.
Love it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been so much fun to discover something new and just get this education through food and through your podcast. And I can't imagine anyone not being interested in all these linguistic things. I find it fascinating. You and me both, Heather. We should have.
I know.
We're going to come study in our next life.
It's just as exciting for me to get an opportunity to talk about it, because I love talking about it so much. So thank you.
Absolutely.
And now for the fine print. Links to recipes and other things we talked about in this episode can be found in the show notes or on our website, www.threekitchenspodcast.com. Come say hello on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, YouTube, and TikTok. We'd love to connect. And if you enjoy the show, pass it on. Word of mouth is the #1 way people learn about new podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, it's my essential oil that I keep in my freezer.